Turmoil. Such a music to every Ukrainian's ears and such a frightening one for anyone living beyond the border. After all, in Russia, trouble traditionally refers to a civil war, when everyone fights against everyone else and each person is for themselves. Complete lawlessness, nothing less. If we don't count the era of feudal fragmentation, there have been two such periods of turmoil in Russian history. 400 years ago, when power was seized one after another by false Dimitris and other scum. And 100 years ago, when the Bolsheviks tried to ignite the flame of a world revolution. And in both cases, this fire almost burned Russia itself to the ground. That is why today Ukrainians are hoping so much for a third time of turmoil, which, if it doesn't completely break up Russia, will at least weaken the central government and make it impossible to continue the war with Ukraine. And most importantly, there are very significant reasons for this. Moreover, inside dear Russia itself, there is a group that is actually provoking this very turmoil with their statements. And in this video, we will analyze what this party of turmoil actually represents. Who is part of it, and what its members are trying to achieve. We will try to find out who is behind this group and what their true goals are. We will touch on the topic of the confrontation between the so-called Kremlin towers, and we will recall our old acquaintance Girkin Strelkov. And finally, we will answer a simple question. Can this very party of turmoil benefit Ukraine? My name is Semyon, Mega Show TV channel. Let's get going. What is the party of turmoil? First of all, we need to clearly define what we mean by the term party of turmoil. This is a very loose label for a rather large group of various Russian bloggers, or rather even pseudo-bloggers who operate exclusively on Telegram channels. And in fact, they spread information that contradicts official Kremlin propaganda or is simply silenced by censorship, and primarily regarding events on the Russian-Ukrainian front. But these Telegram channels don't just describe some military events. But they specifically and deliberately highlight all sorts of gaps in the Russian army, the large number of dead and wounded, corruption and decay in the rear. But most of all, the accusations are directed at incompetent leadership, thick-headed generals, traitors in the headquarters, and the like. In other words, these Telegram channels aren't just spreading some kind of dark rumors. And most often, they present a more or less realistic or even exaggeratedly negative picture compared to the official Russian propaganda. Naturally, for the average Russian layperson, especially in the remote countryside, who is used to the classic primitive propaganda in the style of Solovyov and Skabiva, such revelations can not only cause surprise but also a sense of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. And most importantly, it causes distrust towards the authorities and the ruling elite as a whole. That's why these very Telegram channels have been called the party of unrest. Because they objectively sow panic within an already stressed society. But if you think that the party of unrest consists of those who are against the war, and especially against the Putin regime, then you are deeply mistaken. These are not the so-called good Russians. These are not your typical liberals like Mikhail Khodorkovsky or Ilya Yashin or Maxim Katz, who are now in exile. And not even moderate nationalists like the late Alexei Navalny. On the contrary, the party of unrest actually advocates for continuing the war with Ukraine until victory. For taking Kiev, Lviv and raising the Russian tricolor in Uzhhorod and Mukachevo. These Telegram channels are constantly filled with calls to stop being soft on the Ukrainians, to start fighting really hard. The party of unrest mainly pushes for shifting the economy to a war footing, general mobilization, and reinstating the death penalty in Russia, and often for launching a strike with tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So, the party of unrest consists of radical, ultra-right, and even openly neo-Nazi forces. But at the same time, their activities de facto destabilize the situation inside Russia. It creates a background for destabilization, for the emergence of conflict within the ruling circles, and in general for any potential upheavals. At the same time, the bloggers themselves position themselves as true patriots of Russia, the so-called Z community, and the passionate part of Russian society, ready at any moment to die for Mother Russia and the Tsar. But as for the Tsar and the Chekist mafia regime he created, they don't really honor that. And that's actually the whole paradox, even the absurdity of the situation, because any other person in Russia, even a milder criticism of the authorities would have led to 5 to 7 years in jail by now, at least under the fake news article about the army. They could also easily be charged with inciting extremism or stirring up interethnic hatred. After all, the old Lubyanka principle still operates in Russia. If there's a person, they'll always find an article to charge them with. But no, the party of turmoil continues to flourish freely, and at the same time it generates all sorts of panic and discredits the army, in which they themselves supposedly wish for victory over the damned Ukrops. It's exactly this unscientific paradox that we'll try to analyze today. How did it all start? To figure things out further, we need to look back 4 years. We need to understand how, when, and most importantly, under what circumstances. The notorious Z Patriots Party appeared on the horizon, as they call themselves. First of all, we need to remember that the distrust of a significant part of Russian society towards official Kremlin propaganda arose in the very first weeks of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It became clear to any more or less thinking person that the special military operation was definitely not going according to plan, and that the set goals were still very far away, even back then in the spring of 2022. Harsh criticism of the official actions of the Putin regime began to be voiced, especially towards the army command led by then Defense Minister Shoigu and the chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov. One of the first to start this wave was our old acquaintance Girkin who openly began to speak out about the catastrophic underestimation of Ukraine's potential, about the defeats of the Russian army near Kyiv, and the need to carry out mobilization in Russia. However, we'll talk about this character a little later. As for the Z-bloggers, they first showed themselves as an organized force half a year later, in September 2022, during the famous Kharkiv counteroffensive by the Ukrainian armed forces. When Ukrainian troops broke through the front near Balaklia and began the rapid liberation of the Kharkiv region, as well as the northern part of Donbass, at the same time, for a long period, Putin and his inner circle. They hid the real situation at the front from the deceived people. It was at that time that Telegram channels appeared, where the administrators, who called themselves war correspondents or vonkors, came to light. They began to spread information about the defeat of the Russian army, the mass retreat from their positions, and the complete helplessness of the generals. The political leadership also came under fire at that time. The war correspondents openly condemned the capital's officials, saying that they continued as if nothing had happened to celebrate the 875th anniversary of Moscow, and to open the tallest Ferris wheel in Europe while there was complete collapse and chaos at the front. That was the first time the party of chaos revealed itself. And even then, many people in Russia had at least two logical questions. Where did these bloggers get so much classified and even top secret information about the situation at the front? And why is no one shutting this operation down? But the Z community began to strengthen its position more and more. And most importantly, it started to rally around another somewhat forgotten figure, Yevgeny Prigozhin. I will definitely make a separate video about Prigozhin and his unfinished mutiny, but right now something else is important to say. Initially, this whole Z crowd was praising the Wagner fighters in every possible way, making real heroes out of them. But at the same time, they ruthlessly criticized Shoigu, Gerasimov, and other generals, as well as the sluggish command system as a whole, the lousy army logistics, and the lack of everything necessary on the ground. And of course, the total embezzlement, which has been the calling card of the Russian army at least since the First Chechen War, if not earlier. By the spring of 2023, this entire network of Telegram channels had not only promoted Prigozhin and Wagner PMC as the true heroes of Russia, but in fact they were waging a full-scale information war against the Russian command. The famous meme from that time, Shoigu, Gerasimov, damn it, where are the munitions? It was created by these very Z-bloggers. The party of turmoil fully lived up to its nickname. In this way, the groundwork for a real military mutiny was being laid with very intensive steps. How it all ended, you know just as well as I do. When Prigozhin's coup was suppressed and Prigozhin himself was blown up on his own plane, all these war correspondents quieted down for a while. It seemed that the turmoil was nipped in the bud. But soon a new celebration came for the Z channels, and it was connected to the successful Kursk operation by the armed forces of Ukraine in August 2024. And while the official propagandists were trumpeting that Ukraine's invasion of Russian territory was nothing more than evidence of the Kiev regime's desperation and that it wasn't worth a dime, but the party of turmoil immediately started spreading panic, at the same time accusing the command of being slow-witted and short-sighted, unable to foresee such a turn of events and to strengthen the border in advance. And although Shoigu had already been transferred to the position of Security Council Secretary at that time, he got his share of criticism too, but the lion's share of the blame fell on Gerasimov. However, Gerasimov managed to keep his position. The next surge of activity from the troublemakers happened in November of 2025. Ukrainian forces managed to liberate the city of Kupiansk in Kharkiv with a sudden, precise strike after the enemy had almost completely captured it. At that time, all those Z bloggers and war correspondents unanimously blamed the commanders for the situation that had arisen, who failed to submit accurate reports about the military situation. They misled their superiors. Because of this, the necessary reserves were withdrawn from near Kupiansk. The armed forces of Ukraine, in turn, took effective advantage of this. They unexpectedly launched a counteroffensive in this area. By the way, federal channels and Russian official media didn't say anything at all about the loss of Kupiansk, so a clear and quite obvious trend is emerging. When things start going seriously wrong somewhere along the front, the party of turmoil immediately appears, which, relying on specific objective facts, demands the replacement of the top generals, and first of all, of course, Valery Gerasimov. So that later, with a clear conscience, they can once again launch a great liberation campaign towards Kiev, Odessa, and Lviv. And if necessary, even use nuclear weapons. Well, why hold back? What do we have at the moment? So, at the moment, there exists in Russia, and doing so with complete impunity, a certain political or more likely military political group, represented by several dozen Telegram channels. They systematically and deliberately stir up waves of political sentiment. But at the same time, their activities are effectively beyond the reach of several articles of the Russian Criminal Code, including discrediting the army and inciting interethnic hatred. At the same time, Z channels, with very few exceptions, do not allow themselves to directly attack Putin. However, in essence, they are waging a full-scale information war against him and the state system he created on almost all fronts. They are trying to inflame all the internal contradictions that exist in Russia. In recent years, they have been actively writing about interethnic and interreligious conflicts. This lays the groundwork for widespread destabilization in the country. For example, recall how Russians commonly treat so-called Kachiks and Churkas from conquered territories. At the same time, these so-called true patriots demand war until total victory. They oppose any negotiated deals. For example, they are against short-term energy and Easter ceasefires with Ukraine. From their point of view, this is quite logical. The longer the war goes on, the more problems accumulate. And the higher the chances of internal upheaval in Russia. They could try to use that wave to shake those in power. That's why it's fair to call this whole Z crowd not the party of war, but rather the party of turmoil. Again, let me repeat. All these so-called war correspondents and angry bloggers are even further from the ideas of freedom and pacifism than Putin himself. Previously, they used to criticize the Kremlin for being too liberal in its approach to war. They called for taking Stalin and North Korea as examples, tighten the screws inside society as much as possible, carry out total mobilization, cancel the huge payments to soldiers, and fight the way our grandfathers and great-grandfathers used to. That is, for a bowl of barley porridge and tea with 2 saccharin tablets. And in recent months, these same war bloggers have been openly criticizing the attempt to block Telegram in Russia. By the way, we have a separate video about this on our channel. But Z bloggers are not protesting out of love for freedom of speech at all. It's purely out of their own selfish interests. Because blocking or even slowing down the most popular digital platform in Russia limits their influence, media activity, and of course their earnings. After all, the main child of the future Russian Chabernet, the top-down imposed Messenger Max, simply doesn't provide them with any alternative. And to sum up, I'll list those very Z channels on Telegram. No, of course, you shouldn't clutter your feed by subscribing, and God forbid you make any reposts. Although many of them are simply impossible to open in Ukraine without a VPN. However, you can scroll through them out of curiosity. It's especially nice to read in the morning after a Ukrainian drone has hit another oil refinery or oil terminal. And there's a lot of whining about when the much-praised Russian air defense will finally start working. In reality, it can't even handle cheap drones. Assembled from Chinese components, it's like balm for the soul. And so, the largest Telegram channel in the Z community is Ribery, with an audience of almost 1.5 million people. Its founder and administrator is Mikhail Zvinchuk, a former employee of the Russian Ministry of Defense Press Service. This public page is one of the oldest. For a long time, it was supported by Prigozhin. Now, it positions itself as a serious analytical platform, where systemic problems of the army are regularly highlighted: poor logistics, excessive bureaucracy, and local assaults. The incompetence of certain generals and the personal chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov. The channel Operation Z occupies a similar niche: war correspondents of the Russian Spring, who also regularly criticize the Russian command for stupidity and a lack of understanding of the specifics of modern warfare. They focus attention on failures at the front, and they demand radical changes in the army's command structure. At the same time, the analysis is mixed with solid, non-Nazi propaganda in the spirit of the former Wagner Group. A channel with a distinctly social subtext is Two Majors. They specialize in what is called trench truth, meaning the publication of letters and complaints from the front lines. The channel regularly criticizes the General Staff and Ministry of Defense for being out of touch, poorly supplying the front, hiding real losses, and self-righteousness, conducting unprepared offensive operations just for the sake of sending impressive, loyal reports to Moscow. There is a channel with the telling name Obsessed with War. It's known for its harsh criticism of Russian generals and constant complaints about problems with troop management, lack of coordination between different units, shortages of military equipment, personnel, and so on. That's why at the same time there's also a push for a new wave of full-scale mobilization in Russia. The channel Military Informant specializes in criticizing mid-level staff commanders for feeding false information to their superiors, hiding real problems on the ground, and presenting wishful thinking as reality. This ultimately leads to an echo chamber effect and a lack of understanding of the real situation at the front. There are also 24 smaller channels like Vargonza, Seraya Zona, Romanov Light, Starshi Ed, and Migrossi, as well as frankly niche non-Nazi, ultra-radical public pages. What unites all of them, besides objective criticism of the situation at the front from Russia's point of view, is the belief in the need for the complete military defeat of Ukraine, regardless of any casualties, even up to the use of weapons of mass destruction. That's what these Z-Patriots are like in all their glory. Who could benefit from the party of turmoil? Over 100 years ago, Vladimir Mayakovsky wrote, "If the stars are being lit, it means someone needs it." And indeed, if you want to understand the true nature of any process, first find out who benefits from it. So who in Russia benefits from the completely legal existence of these Telegram channels, which essentially discredit the military leadership and to some extent the political leadership, and spread negativity at every convenient and inconvenient opportunity? And this is happening under the strictly vertical, hierarchical Putin regime, where not only any attempt at criticism is suppressed, but even any horizontal connections are simply cut off. What is the reason for this unprecedented and uncontrolled outbreak of freedom of speech? Or is it not so uncontrolled after all? However, let's take it one step at a time. First of all, it should be noted that such treacherous narratives are spread exclusively in Telegram channels and are completely absent from official propaganda media. However, these channels have a very strong influence on a specific target audience. And this is actually quite a significant segment of society: military personnel, law enforcement officers, hardcore Z-Patriots, as well as their family members. Plus those who actively profit from the war, including so-called volunteers. And therefore such information directly affects both the morale of the Russian army and the opinion of those who still support the continuation of the war in Ukraine, even while sitting at home on their couch with a beer. Secondly, and this is the most important thing, the campaign being conducted by this party of unrest plays a crucial role in eroding the image of the enemy in Russian society. And this is not surprising at all, because according to the classic principles of information warfare, a warring country must cultivate a unified image of the enemy. That is, when a missile hits a house, it's the enemy's fault, not the air defense system that let the missile through. Or the missile was shot down, but debris hit a residential building, killing civilians. Or if there is fighting in a certain city, it's still the enemy's fault, not the command that allowed the enemy to reach that city in the first place. If soldiers are dying en masse at the front, again, it's the enemy's fault, not the incompetent general sending troops into local assaults. This approach, in fact, has been used in every war without exception. If you have a different opinion on this matter, please write it in the comments. In fact, that's why the worst thing that can happen for the authorities and army command in a country at war is precisely the blurring of the enemy's image. A situation where not only the external enemy is blamed for problems, but also the internal one. What can this lead to? The most radical example of this could be seen in Russia in 1917. The revolution led to the breakdown of society, the collapse of the army, mass desertion, and a slide into total chaos and lawlessness. By the way, the Bolsheviks, who did a lot to ignite all this chaos, later, those idiots had a very hard time getting the situation under control and establish a strictly centralized one-party dictatorship. But let's get back to the matter at hand. Given all that has been said during a war, especially a bloody and protracted one, the authorities of any country without exception must do everything possible to suppress the blurring of the enemy's image at the very outset. And against this backdrop, the situation looks even more absurd when this whole crowd systematically promotes the main idea that the internal enemy is no less dangerous than the external one. Additionally, this enemy is entrenched in the army's command, or even in Russia's very holy of holies, in the Kremlin's offices. Moreover, if you analyze all these publications by the Party of Turmoil from a different angle, it turns out that if there are no changes, as the so-called angry patriots want, then in the long run, Russia itself is inevitably doomed to defeat. It's quite an interesting picture, though. But this rampant lawlessness looks even more absurd, considering that inside Russia, for more than a quarter of a century, nothing and no one can do anything without permission from a single person. It turns out that the Party of Turmoil exists only because it has the approval of the great gatherer of Russian lands. It's some kind of nonsense, pure absurdity, but still, no other conclusions come to mind. However, there is a minor but still noteworthy theory that the entire Party of Turmoil, as well as the Prigozhinsky mutiny itself, is an unplanned byproduct of the internal elite struggle. The war between various Kremlin towers, as experts often describe it. This internal feud is, at the very least, about establishing control over the Russian army and the security forces in general, and, as a result, about the right to manage the enormous cash flows that are directed toward the ever-growing needs of the war with Ukraine. There is no more ideal, stable, and practically unchecked way to get rich quickly than years-long military contracts. For example, remember how the United States grew wealthy during the First and Second World Wars? If this theory is correct, then it is extremely disadvantageous for this clan or clans to stop the war purely for financial and economic reasons. That's why, hiding behind an ultra-patriotic agenda, they are not so much trying to defeat Ukraine as to prolong the war for as long as possible in order to make as much money as they can from it. There may never be another chance like this in their lifetime. All that's left is to remove Gerasimov, Shaggy, the war, and other figures from the competing group from this equation, which so far isn't really working out. In any case, even now we can draw a preliminary conclusion that there are influential forces in Russia. And these are clearly not the anti-war liberal circles, for whom the internal struggle for power and making money from the war are much more important and interesting than the final outcome of the war. Expectations of upcoming changes in Russia are inevitably growing against the backdrop of a prolonged war that is clearly not going according to plan. And from this point of view, all this informational hype from the Party of Unrest is not at all a stab in the back of the warring homeland, but rather a flashy PR move that creates for those striving for power a dramatic image of a patriot, a fighter for justice who is prevented from fighting by enemies entrenched in the Ministry of Defense. The trick is extremely risky, but after all, the game is worth the candle. Why does Putin need such troublemakers? But still, even such an intricate version has one important flaw. Putin himself is a factor. Why does the autocrat of all Russia allow the existence of this infighting, which is happening literally right under his nose? Especially since he has more than enough opportunities to nip all this mess in the bud. This isn't some decaying democracy where there are laws, legal norms, and an independent judicial system. Under Putin's dictatorship, a different principle applies. He's a law unto himself. I do whatever I want. I jail whoever I want. And whoever I don't put in, I give them a good scare. Or that's all. So it turns out that Putin still benefits from the activities of the Party of Unrest, no matter who was behind it. And what, one might ask, was the point of that? And the first thing that comes to mind is that it gives a formal reason not to stop the war, not to allow a ceasefire, actions along the front line with a subsequent freezing of the conflict. After all, in that case, this entire Z community can be used as official cover to justify the need to continue the war. That supposedly, the patriotic circles simply won't understand if the president suddenly hits the brakes and stops the Russian army that's rushing into battle. To make it clearer, let's model the situation. Let's break it down in simple terms. Let's imagine a little scenario. A high-ranking official with liberal views enters the bunker, or just someone from Putin's inner circle, someone who understands the real danger of continuing the war. Let's say it's someone like Dmitry Kozak, even though he's long been out of favor and retired. So he comes in and says, "Vladimir Vladimirovich, it's time to stop the special military operation. There's barely any money left. I'm afraid we won't make it." And Putin can always respond, "How can I stop? The guys won't understand me. Look at what the Z Patriots are writing. We need to keep fighting until victory. Otherwise, someone might start a revolt. It could be worse than Prigozhin. Do we need that? So it's better to keep fighting. We'll find money for the war. People will go a bit hungry. So what? Who lives well in Russia anyway?" So Putin can always use the existence of this kind of party of turmoil as an argument for the need to continue the war, simply to avoid internal political upheaval. And although this is a rather primitive manipulation, it can work quite well for the average, not very sophisticated person. After all, as centuries of Russian history show, internal turmoil can turn out to be much more dangerous than an external enemy. And under the cover of the ongoing war, they can keep tightening the screws. Why stop at what they've already achieved? The second reason why the activities of the Party of Turmoil might play into the hands of the Kremlin dwarf is, of course, playing to an external audience, primarily for Western elites. Putin can very well play that card. Like, look, gentlemen Democrats, what terrible people I have in my country. Completely crazy Nazis who want to drop an atomic bomb on Kiev or Lviv, and they might even hit Europe. So I, Tsar Vladimir Tavrichesky, am the best option for everyone. Unlike the Z Patriots, I am quite sane, predictable, a rationalist to the core. You can do business with me. And if I'm suddenly gone, who will keep this pack of rabid dogs on a leash? God forbid they seize power. What then? Hiroshima 2.0. So, dear gentlemen, let's lift the sanctions and start negotiating. And forget about Ukraine. We'll sort it out between ourselves. This is our purely Slavic business. The West just doesn't get it. It's also pretty primitive, however. As practice shows, the principle of choosing the lesser evil often dominates when making strategic decisions. Especially in the West, and the US in particular, there is real concern about instability in Russia, especially the rise to power of more radical forces, so that the nuclear potential doesn't end up in the hands of even more dangerous fanatics than the former KGB lieutenant colonel. By the way, Putin's KGB background can also explain the third reason why he doesn't shut down this whole pro-Z mouthpiece crowd. To use it as a battering ram against army generals and to weaken their influence in advance. Let me explain more clearly. Any war, even if it's a losing one, objectively raises the prestige and influence of the military among broad segments of society. For example, despite the defeat in World War I, Field Marshal Hindenburg was elected president of Germany and remained in office until his death. And Hungary, which was also among the losers in World War I, was ruled for 24 years without opposition by the dictator Vice Admiral Miklos Horthy. But the fact is that since the time of Stalin, the Czechist generals have always competed for power and influence with the army generals, the NKVD against the Red Army, a classic scenario. This is especially true since dictators benefit when their subordinates quarrel to some extent, so that he himself can always stay above the fray and not allow any one group to concentrate too much power in their own hands. Otherwise, a conspiracy is just around the corner. So, being a career KGB officer, Putin instinctively fears the inevitable growing influence of the generals amid a prolonged war. And that's why it's in his interest to strike preemptively, to discredit and weaken the army command, but only to a certain extent so that later they don't get too full of themselves and know their place. And besides, as I already mentioned, the very fact of infighting within the elite actually strengthens the regime rather than weakens it, at least up to a certain point. The main thing here is not to go too far and not to cross the red lines, otherwise the system could spiral out of control and real turmoil will begin. And not just a virtual one, but a very real one. Accordingly, criticism of Shoigu, Gerasimov, and their successors in Telegram channels is extremely convenient for the Kremlin as a tool for potential rotations, purges, and even repressions in the army. Especially since all those Z guys criticize the army generals, but they hardly write anything about the FSB leadership, about Putin's buddies Patrushev and Bortnikov. They are just as much, if not more, to blame for the failure of Putin's blitzkrieg, since for years they fed the general staff complete nonsense, which was the basis for the invasion plans for Ukraine. I also made a separate video about this phenomenon on my channel. As for the information being spread in public forums about real problems with supplies, command, and corruption at the front and in the rear, the Kremlin can always effectively use it for internal power struggles, and thus feed naive people fairy tales about a good czar and bad boyars. And simple Ivanushka the fool will believe anything about the boyars. And simple Ivanushka the fool will swallow even worse than that. Other less important reasons include using the party of turmoil as a kind of valve for periodically letting off steam and channeling discontent. Putin understands perfectly well that a prolonged war inevitably causes deep discontent in Russian society, and he needs to channel it into a relatively safe direction for the authorities. It's better for them to write on Telegram than to go out onto Tverskaya and Red Square. As Eastern wisdom says, if you can't stop it, lead it. Lead it and benefit from it yourself. As long as the problem is under control, it's not that dangerous. Plus, the party of turmoil is still about propaganda and control. You have to act on it and not mess up, because in the end, they shape the right patriotic discourse for the regime. Ukraine is the sworn enemy. We need to continue the war, increase the pressure, but at the same time, root out traitors, Ukrainians and thieves among our own. This approach significantly complements the official propaganda, making it more lively and convincing for the target Russian audience. Paradoxically, the channels that criticize the command actually increase the audience's trust in the regime as a whole. When the Z crowd writes about problems, it looks the most credible, and officially everything goes according to plan, making these troublemakers more convincing propagandists than traditional media. And once again, the Kremlin has fallen into the trap of the very ideology it built itself. Since for the past 4 years the authorities have based state ideologies on ultra-patriotism and support for the war, within this logic, imprisoning a so-called liberal or simply an opponent of the war for spreading fake news about the army is easy and understandable for the system. But imprisoning a person who demands to fight harder, tougher, and more effectively is ideologically very difficult. In the long run, this could demoralize the troops at the front and lead to accusations of betrayal against the authorities from their own assault troops. Thus, the activities of the Party of Unrest are in many ways beneficial to Putin as a complex but quite effective tool for management, pressure, and mobilization, but only as long as it stays within certain limits. This is a classic tactic of authoritarian regimes, allowing moderate criticism from below on tactical issues in order to maintain strategic control over the situation and keep the core of the ruling regime intact. What do the troublemakers themselves want? However, the fact that the Party of Unrest is to some extent beneficial to Putin does not mean that his goals and the goals of those behind these troublemakers completely coincide. Even Russia's vast security apparatus, which has always been the backbone of Putin's regime, has never been monolithic. For decades, agencies have continually competed. FSB versus the Army, National Guard versus Ministry of Internal Affairs, Investigative Committee versus Prosecutor General's Office. And among civilians, officials, and business circles, there is an order of magnitude more scheming. The same kind of infighting is happening across the border, or a fight between scoundrels and villains. It's not easy to determine the real goal of those who control the Party of Turmoil, but the most obvious and reasonable versions include the following. First and most basic is that all this frantic activity by the Z Patriots is nothing more than an element of the interclan war within the upper circles of the Russian elite, the notorious struggle between the Kremlin towers. That's why these bloggers and war correspondents are simply being used by separate political groups to fight competitors and push for personnel changes. Apparently they want to completely remove Shoigu, whom they hate so much, from the power vertical, and of course Gerasimov, who, despite all this Kremlin Game of Thrones drama, has held the position of Chief of the General Staff for 14 years now. Who to replace them with is still a big question. At the beginning of the war, the name of General Surovikin often appeared in public discussions. For a while, he was in charge of the entire group of occupying forces in Ukraine. But after the suppression of Prigozhin's mutiny, with whom he had certain connections, he was removed from all his positions and sent to Algeria to lead the Russian military specialists. Now, for the past couple of years, Telegram channels have been creating the image of a successful commander for General Teplinsky, who is currently fighting in the Donbass. However, considering the pace at which his subordinates are advancing near Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, he has no chance of getting a high position. The second version is actually an addition to the first, kind of an extended director's cut of the events taking place. It's about the fact that the people behind the Party of Turmoil are trying not only to take control of the Russian army and financial flows, but also to significantly tighten domestic policy. To tighten the screws even more, to reduce the influence of state institutions, for example, the courts, which still, at least to some extent, restrain the lawlessness of the security forces. And the Party of Turmoil justifies and actively supports this lawlessness, such as torture and killings of detainees. This includes demands to reinstate the death penalty, including for corruption. As for the military sphere, everything here is standard, declaring total mobilization for everyone, shifting the entire Russian economy to a war footing, including tightening belts for the population and the entire civilian sector. And of course, the use of nuclear weapons, including preemptive strikes on Europe, which is currently the main rear base for Ukraine. Experts most often name supporters of this more radical version of Putinism as Putin's aide and former personal bodyguard, Alexei Deumin, as well as Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Nikolai Patrushev, a longtime Putin friend from the St. Petersburg backstreets. The third version, the most interesting of all, is that the true goal of the Party of Turmoil and its patrons is to overthrow Putin and seize supreme power for themselves. Here, everything is simple and at the same time very complicated. Naturally, when the little Tsar has been ruling unchallenged for almost 30 years and has no intention of leaving, the lower-ranking leaders inevitably start to feel both tired of the dictator, who becomes more capricious and unpredictable with age, and at the same time develop a desire to run the country themselves. This is especially true for those who are 20 or 30 years younger than Putin and his circle, and who consider the current version of the Politburo to be hopelessly outdated and out of touch with reality. Therefore, the desire not to wait until the gatherers of Russian lands are carried out of the Kremlin feet first, but to speed up this biological process a little, is quite logical and fair. The other thing is that carrying out this overthrow is technically difficult, considering the paranoid suspiciousness of Rashila Karlik and other serious security measures. Moreover, at the moment, for all these Z-patriots, there is an unspoken but absolutely concrete law. A taboo on personal criticism of Putin. The Tsar is good, the boyars are bad. And that's it. Otherwise, you'll lose your head. The fourth version, in my opinion, is the most conspiratorial and the least provable of them all. It suggests that the Party of Turmoil and its curator are working together with Western and Ukrainian intelligence agencies who are using it to destabilize the situation inside Russia in order to defeat it in the war. Or, at the very least, to demonstrate the internal weakness of the Putin regime and encourage someone like Donald Trump not to make major concessions during negotiations. But in terms of information, the activity of the party really does coincide in many ways with the trends set by Kyiv and the West, and this has been the case for a long time, since the preparations for Prigozhin's mutiny. In addition, the ultra-right non-Nazi circles themselves, which form the core of the Z crowd, have traditionally been hostile to the Chekist Putin, although in recent years they have been forced to outwardly demonstrate loyalty to him. However, I repeat, there is no real evidence for this theory, although it can be said with certainty that there is definitely a mole in the Tsar's circle, and possibly more than one. Otherwise, American and British intelligence would not have learned about the plans to attack Ukraine as early as the fall of 2021, while the overwhelming majority of the Russian elite had no knowledge of it. The Girkin case. And of course, I couldn't help but pay at least some attention to the most famous, especially in Ukraine, betrayal-obsessed Igor Girkin Strelkov. I have already discussed his key role and place in igniting a full-scale war in Donbass in 2014 in a separate video, but today I will talk about something else. Almost from the very first weeks of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, since March 2022, he began publicly and relentlessly criticizing the Russian command. Moreover, almost all of his arguments were absolutely objective and were confirmed over time. But at the same time, Girkin did not advocate for ending the war with Ukraine. On the contrary, he called for intensifying it. He was one of the first in Russia to publicly call for mobilization. In other words, he looked like a typical representative of this so-called party of turmoil. But why was he sentenced to 4 years for extremism? Did he really pose a real threat to the regime? The answer to that is quite simple. Girkin allowed himself too much. Moreover, his fate clearly showed exactly where that red line lies, beyond which the system stops balancing and starts destroying. In fact, he was imprisoned not for criticizing the conduct of the war itself, but for violating the fundamental rule of survival in the modern Russian political system. He went from criticizing the generals to criticizing Putin personally, and that's a fundamental difference. After all, by calling the self-appointed autocrat a nobody, a coward, an incompetent, and a louse, he broke an unspoken taboo and paid the price for it. Plus, the overly independent Girkin went even further and tried to enter the realm of real politics. In the spring of 2023, he founded the Club of Angry Patriots. And this is already an attempt to turn the amorphous mass of dissatisfied ultra-patriots into a real political movement with its own structure, regional branches, and political program. On the eve of the 2024 presidential elections, the emergence of an uncontrollable and extremely radical force capable of attracting a significant portion of the brainwashed electorate looked extremely dangerous for the Kremlin. In a word, Girkin's arrest is a key event for the entire party of turmoil, and very telling. The Kremlin has already openly made it clear that criticism of military tactics and command errors is more or less acceptable. But challenging the supreme ruler's sacred status and legitimacy is an absolute taboo. The system perceives such attacks as a direct threat to the stability of the state apparatus. Essentially, both Girkin and Prigozhin, even though they were personal enemies of the Putin regime, represented the same danger: uncontrolled armed ultra-patriotism. And they were dealt with, each in their own way. But what is our interest? Of course, everyone is interested in the answer to the main question. Is there any benefit for Ukraine in the fact that such a party of turmoil exists in Russia? And if there is, what is it? At first glance, the question is rhetorical. First of all, what use is it if it is controlled and managed? And many so-called war correspondents and Z-bloggers definitely have FSB officer ranks. Secondly, if these angry patriots, or rather those who stand behind them, do come to power, they definitely won't end the war. From any point of view, whether political or economic, they simply need the war to continue. The longer, the better. However, if you look closer, there is some benefit after all, although it's not absolute and comes with a number of serious caveats. First of all, pro-Z channels spread information that in itself is an extremely valuable and completely free source for Ukrainian and Western intelligence services. Even if you take into account that this information is filtered, experienced analysts will still be able to extract the grain of truth when studying data about losses, supply problems, incompetence of specific commanders, and weak points in the defense. At the very least, they can identify logistical routes and the locations of provisions, ammunition, and equipment. No official Russian source would ever provide such information. Secondly, there are, of course, propaganda and psychological effects. All these complaints and grievances are actively quoted and reposted by Ukrainian media. And this, in turn, is a powerful tool for demoralizing Russian society and boosting morale in Ukraine. Just think about it. When their own ultra-patriots systematically claim that Gerasimov is lying to Putin, that the losses at the front are enormous, that incompetent commanders are sending soldiers to certain death, all of this works on the Russian audience incomparably more effectively than any information from Ukrainian or Western media. In such a situation, Ukraine doesn't need to do anything at all, just not interfere. Over time, this state of affairs makes at least some Russians start to question whether the Russian leadership is capable of bringing the war to a victorious end. And there is the main reason, which directly follows from the previous one, the increase of internal destabilization in Russia with the prospect of it turning into real turmoil. Such Telegram channels objectively create and reinforce the feeling of an inevitable looming crisis, failure, and betrayal, even among the brainwashed masses. This inevitably sharpens confidence in victory, sows distrust towards Putin and the system, and provokes new internal conflicts among the elite. Even if they do not lead to a full-scale social explosion or revolution, they still divert the Kremlin's resources to the need for increased internal control. Moreover, constant criticism of the military command forces the Tsar to react in some way, to carry out rotations and purges, which objectively distracts from the front and sometimes leads to real mistakes or a weakening of troop management. For Ukraine, a period of such turbulence is a tactical window of opportunity. In turn, under constant fear of dismissal or arrest, Russian generals on the ground begin to act ineffectively. Often, they are afraid to show initiative, hide problems from the general staff, and to make matters worse, a Z-blogger might find out everything and blow up a scandal. Or on the contrary, they give ill-considered orders, which can lead to senseless losses of personnel and equipment. So, an army where commanders are more afraid of public backlash from Telegram channels than of the enemy is an army with very serious management problems. In general, it can be said with confidence that the Party of Turmoil is only a situational ally, a fellow traveler for Ukraine. Just like the anarchist Nestor Makhno was for the Bolsheviks or Stalin was for Roosevelt and Churchill during World War II. Therefore, the immediate benefit for Ukraine from these so-called military correspondents does exist, but it is mainly informational, psychological, and destabilizing. That is, it works toward the slow, long-term weakening of Russia from within. In the context of a prolonged war, such an internal Trojan horse in the Russian information space is definitely extremely useful. That's exactly why Ukrainian analysts closely monitor all these Z communities. However, unfortunately, these efforts still do not replace military successes at the front and do not guarantee a quick collapse of Russia at all. So the benefit of the Party of Turmoil is rather an additional factor in the existential war for Ukraine's independence. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all the sponsors for supporting the channel, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.